weeks where we've been talking about this. I'm going to start with just a little tiny review of what we've been thinking about. First thing is that spiritual affective disorder is not the same thing as seasonal affective disorder. That's caused physiologically and it's treatable physiologically. And seasonal affective disorder has to do with becoming depressed or sad or lethargic, especially during the winter when it's so much darker. Spiritual affective disorder is a spiritual parallel of that, and some of its symptoms include things like depression or sadness about our spiritual life, or difficulty praying, or being lethargic and just not really caring too much about our relationship with God. And last week we talked about one of the causes of spiritual affective disorder, and there are lots of them, way more than we're going to do in this sermon series, but last week we talked about one of the causes of it being when we lose sight of what it is that God has called us to be and created us to be, because when we lose sight of those gifts and talents God has given each one of us, life is just not as good. We're less happy, we're less motivated, life feels less abundant. We are much more prone to spiritual affective disorder. And today we're going to talk about another cause of spiritual affective disorder, which is on one hand really simple and on the other hand really complex. And on the simple side, it has to do with our answer to the question, who is God? Who is God? On the complex side, it has to do with all of those things we think and believe about what God is like and how God acts or does not act in the world. The things we believe about who or what this person or energy or entity or whatever God is that we call God actually is. Now, most of us this morning grew up going to Sunday school and church, and if we did, we had Sunday school teachers and we had pastors, and every Sunday they told us what they believed God was like. And so they would read us Bible stories, and at Christmas we'd all get to put on the little bathrobe costumes and act out the Christmas story. And both by their examples and by what they said, we learned what they thought that God was like. And maybe they told us that God was loving. And maybe they told us that God is angry. And maybe they told us that God is always hospitable. There's always room at God's table. And maybe they told us that God is judgmental. And they may have told us any number of things. And we got some more messages about who God is, what God is like from our families. If we grew up in a family that had any feelings at all about faith, and that may have included that faith was a lot of garbage, or it may have been that faith's really important, our families told us what they thought God was like, and sometimes their ideas about that matched what we were learning in Sunday school, and sometimes they didn't, and when they don't, that's really confusing. And some people walk out of childhood and say, enough of this church business, because nobody really knows, and there's no good answer, and everybody's telling me different stuff. And depending on what kind of schools we went to and what kind of communities we spent our time in when we were growing up, we may have gotten still more messages about what God is like. You know, let's say that you went to a public school, but your three best friends went to, let's say, Lutheran school, and you got together and you're saying, well, you know, my Sunday school teacher taught me that God is like this, and they're all going, oh, that's not right. No, we learned that God is like that. With all those different influences and all of them between childhood and now, we arrived this morning, February 20th, 2011, Grand Junction, Colorado, First Congregational Church, with some internal sense of what our answer is to that question, who is God? And what is God like? And depending on what our answer is to that question, we may be more or less prone to spiritual affective disorder. For example, one of my favorite personal images of God comes from a couple of the Gospels where Jesus is telling the people what God is like. And he describes God as being like a mother hen gathering her chicks under her wings. It's one of those gospel passages that doesn't get preached real often, but God is like a mother hen gathering her chicks under her wings, and I love that image. It reminds me of when I was a little kid, and we used to make summer vacations, trips to Ohio, where my Aunt Dot and Uncle Ken had a farm. And on their farm, there were chickens and ducks and cows, pigs, all other kind of farm animals. And one of my favorite things to do as a little kid was scooch down right next to the chicken pen and watch the chickens. And when I was little, I didn't know what kind they were. Now I know they were Rhode Island Reds. They were magnificent chickens. And I thought they were the most gorgeous creatures I'd ever seen. And so I would sit there for hours watching the chickens. And one of the things I learned about chickens is they are, because they're prey animals, they're acutely aware of danger. And so if some strange shadow passes by or there's some unexpected odd noise, the chickens all panic. And they start making chicken panic sounds. And the mama chickens call their babies and they gather them under their wings to keep them safe. So that if there is a predator, the predator is going to eat mom first before it can get to the babies. And when I think about God being like those mama chickens, gathering us under her wings, that makes me feel safe and comforted and loved. And that's the total opposite of spiritual affective disorder, and it's a pretty good preventative against it. And maybe that's kind of, if you have a God, or at least one of the image, because most of us have more than one, or you might have a very different image of God that's very different from that notion of God as mother hen. Let's suppose that your Sunday school teachers or preachers or both drew their lessons from some of those really scary places in the Old Testament, like the story of Noah. If you really think about the story of Noah, you should be totally baffled why any Sunday school teacher would ever tell the story to a child. Because the story of Noah is that God intentionally drowns, intentionally murders all the people and all the animals on the earth except for Noah and his family and the animals they took onto the ark. That is a ghastly story. And doesn't give us a very happy image of God, even though you get the rainbow thing at the end of it. You know, or maybe your minister, when I was growing up, we had a minister, I remember it seemed like he preached on this every Sunday. The story where Abraham nearly kills his son Isaac because God tells him to. I find that a pretty scary image of God. Or maybe you grew up on the story of Cain, where he kills his brother Abel because God likes Abel's sacrifice better than God likes Cain's sacrifice. And those stories just come from the first couple of chapters of the Bible. And if you grew up on stories like that, your sense of God, instead of being warm and nurturing and gathering and safe, might be cruel and punitive and terrifying. A person or an entity or a power that's always afflicting people with wars and plagues and death. The kind of image that can lead to a really serious case of spiritual affective disorder. What we sometimes forget is when we look to the Bible for answers to our faith questions, like, let's look up in the Bible, everybody whip out your pew Bible and find what the real answer is to what God is like or who God is. The Bible doesn't offer us one single solitary image of God. There is no one place you can say, well, the Bible says God is. I mean, you can point to that, but what the Bible says God is very different in different places. And that's because we sometimes forget that the Bible was not something that, let's say, our choir sat down one afternoon and decided they would write, and all together in consultation with the best group dynamics management possible, they sat down and wrote this Hummer. The Bible was written over hundreds of years by dozens of different people who lived in different places, in different time periods, living in different circumstances, and who themselves had been told different things about who or what God is. And so it's not surprising, and it's not theologically problematic that when we turn to the Bible, we have all these different pictures of who God is.